Not long ago, I made a video talking about how the Tournament of Sources could have gone if it wasn't rigged to begin with, and I did come to a conclusion on who would have won when it did come to that respective season. But we of course have another instance of a tournament happening within the course of Ninjago, and I do think that one is another fairly interesting one because that one was also rigged by the actual host. And of course, that is the Tournament of Elements from Season 4. And the question to me has always been, who would have won that tournament if it wasn't rigged? But luckily we do have an idea on what the original brackets were looking like before any sort of Chen interference. So for today we're going to look through these individual fights and give our best determination on who could have won the tournament if it wasn't for Chen, and give a good idea as to who the best Elemental Master was at that given time. And of course, like always, I would like to know what you guys think when it does come to my interpretation, and if you come to a different conclusion, because that is the joy of Ninjago, anyone can have their own opinion on it. But let me not waste any more of your time, and let's talk about what if the Tournament of Elements wasn't rigged. Now luckily we do have an idea on what the original brackets looked like before Chen did any meddling. This seems to be the most unrigged version of what things could have looked like that we actually would have seen throughout the course of the tournament. And here it is, this is what you actually see on screen. And I do think this is fairly interesting because it does seem fairly balanced. And a lot of these fights we do see, and also a lot of them we don't. So rebooted Kai aside, let's actually take a look at how these fights could have gone. Going in order from how we actually see them on the board itself, Griffin Turner versus Gravis we actually do get to see within the show. It was fairly unrigged, I don't think there was any outright depiction of rigging going on within this fight. So the winner would have been Griffin Turner, and he would have gone through to the next round. The next one was Kai versus Ash, and again we get to see this within the show, and it's not rigged as well. We outright know for a fact that it wasn't because Jen was enjoying the fight. So again, this fight was fairly unchanged, and it would have gone to Kai, so he would have gone through to the next round still as well. Jay versus Mr. Pale is something we never got to see because of Chen's meddling, so taking into account that this fight basically doesn't exist within the show, we kind of have to interpret it from here. I do personally think that Jay still would have won this fight. I think Jay still holds an edge over Mr. Pale, because as soon as you get around the fact that you just simply can't see him, it's kind of just a case of taking him out from there, and Jay's lightning abilities certainly do have area of effect type abilities, so I do think it's safe to assume that Jay would have been able to overpower Mr. Pale in this instance, so Jay goes through as well. Skylar versus Jacob is another interesting one because we do see it, but again there's no outright confirmation that it was rigged. It seems to be that Chen was actually enjoying watching the fight as well, and Skylar is fairly good at fighting when it does come down to it, so I do think this fight still would have played out the exact same. I think Skylar still would have gone through, so she is going through to the next round. After that is Balobo versus Nero, and again this is another fight that we have no indication on being actually rigged, so this one also does play out the exact same. This was honestly a really cool fight to actually see within the show as well, but again Nero is going to take the win and he is going to move on to the next round. And honestly, even if it was rigged, I still think this would have made sense because it kind of just makes sense. After that is Karloff versus Tox. Again, this is another fight that we don't actually get to see play out. I do think this is another fairly interesting one, and I do think this would have been a fairly fun one to have actually seen. Honestly, I don't entirely know how this fight would have gone. I do think there's a lot of reason to believe that either or could have actually have done it, but I do think in this instance, Tox would have beat out Karloff. I do think it would have happened because we do get to hear within the season that Shade is actually the one that took her on, and she was difficult to actually take out. So I do think Tox would have edged it out just purely because it is implied that she is a very good fighter. So she's going to go through. I'm so sorry, Karloff. Cole versus Shade is the last one that we don't get an outright depiction of, and I do think this is going to be a fairly difficult one because they're two extremely good fighters. But again, I do honestly think Cole would have won in this scenario. I do think we would have actually seen him beat out Shade, in similar vein to how he beat out Mr. Pale if anything. Cole basically nullified elemental power in any fight that he does take part in, so I do think he could have done the exact same thing for Shade. I do think Shade would have been overpowered by Cole on an overall, so I do think he would have gone through. So again, I'm extremely sorry Shade, but I do think the Master of Earth just simply wins in this instance. And then last but certainly not least is Camille versus Lloyd, and even when the odds were stacked wildly against Lloyd, he still won within the actual show. So getting rid of any form of rigging or any sort of bias, it's fairly clear to assume that Lloyd was going to win. It's very clear that Lloyd is most definitely going to go through, and I feel like there is no argument when it does come to it. So he goes through, and that is fairly good to see. But with that, the first rounds are actually done, and bringing back the image of the board, we will now move on to round 2, where the winner of the round 1 will take on the person that's directly opposite them. That is going to be where the next fight will go down, and this is certainly going to be where things become a whole lot more interesting. So let's get into those ones as well. Griffin Turner versus Kai I do think would have been a very interesting pairing, because both of them have a very interesting fighting style, and I don't know how it would have really applied to the other. Honestly, this is a really tough one, and I do think this one is very open to interpretation, but I do think it's still going to be a case of Kai winning out this fight. I do think Kai stands a fairly good chance against Griffin Turner, and I don't really think it's much of a contest. I do think it's quite close, and I do understand why it could go the other way, but again, coming down to the idea of simply overpowering, I do think Kai has that on lock. Kai has faced a lot of interesting opponents, and I do think Ash is a fairly tough opponent at that. So I do think, honestly, Kai would have still been able to do it, just simply down to how smart he is when it does come to a fight. So I do think Kai wins the Master of Speed, and Kai will go through to the next round. The next pairing is going to be Jay versus Skylar, and this is going to be where I need to introduce a very big factor. We know that Skylar was absorbing elemental power, so I do think it's safe to assume that by this point in time, she would have had every single element under her utility belt. And we do know this outright because of the array that she already had by this point in the season. So it's essentially Jay versus every other element, and unfortunately for that reason, I think Skylar is going to beat out Jay in this fight. I do think Skylar, having all of those powers along with actually having good fighting ability, is something that is very difficult to be stopped. And I do think that's fairly safe to assume, especially considering that we see Chen also use the same array of powers in the actual season, and him, who is absolutely terrible at fighting, is still able to overpower people. So I do think adding an actual fighting skill does translate to a fighter that is going to be very difficult to take down. So because of that, Skylar is going to be beating out Jay when it does come to this fight. Tox vs Neuro is the easiest ones in my opinion of the round 2 fight. I do think Neuro does beat out Tox. Neuro just simply would be able to overpower just simply with the power of the mind. How he infiltrates her mind I'm not entirely certain, but I do think it's safe to assume that he would have the edge over her. Of course, she would put up a fight, but I do think it's fairly safe to assume that Neuro would win, because I also think Neuro would have beat out Shade, and Shade also beats out Tox. So I think we can comfortably assume that this is going to be the case, and I kind of just prefer this idea. So Neuro is going to go through to the next round. And then finally, it's going to be Cole versus Lloyd, and this one just kind of sucks. I don't really want to talk about this fight because I kind of don't want to see these two characters go against each other. But I do think Lloyd would beat out Cole. I do think it would be a fairly good fight, but I think where Cole overpowers most elemental masters, Lloyd simply would just overpower Cole. And in similar vein to how it actually plays out in the show itself, I do think Cole would honestly just make the sacrifice play in this moment. I do think Cole would be perfectly opted into the idea of actually losing out willingly. So I do think for that reason, Lloyd is going to move on and beat out Cole. But that one definitely sucked. But that ends off the second round's worth of fight, and we're down to 4 elemental masters. We're down to Kai, Skylar, Neuro, and Lloyd, and they're going to fight the person on their respective half of the board. So let's get into the semi-finals. First off is Kai versus Skylar, and I do think it's fairly safe to assume that this is where Kai would have lost. I think Kai just simply doesn't beat out Skylar purely down to the elemental power. That much energy is something that even the best of masters can't take down. Kai and Skylar also do have a back and forth within the course of the 4th season as well, and Skylar, who's very reluctant to actually fight Kai, still does have some form of a chance, and I do think that's fairly telling of what it does come down to in terms of Skylar's abilities. So I do think her abilities down to also the energy, like I said, is just simply how Kai would be losing out, so Skylar would be going into the final. And then Neuro versus Lloyd. I think this is again another situation where we would have had a lot of different aspects going into it, but Lloyd still would have been the victor. Lloyd has faced much bigger and much harder opponents, and I don't think Neuro has. And Lloyd also does just overpower his elemental abilities, and I just don't think Neuro would really stand a chance against that. It's unfortunate, and there could be an argument for the contrary, but I really don't think Neuro would be able to pull off that fight. And also, it is Lloyd. But that is going to be why Lloyd is going to be going into the finale. So that leaves us with Skylar versus Lloyd, and I do think this is a fairly interesting tournament pairing at that, and I think a lot of people will be disagreeing with my answer on this one. So who do I think is going to win the Tournament of Elements? And well, it's going to be Skylar. Like I have kept mentioning, I think the simple abundance of elemental energy is something that Lloyd simply wouldn't have been able to counter, and I think this is no more prudent than the fact that when Lloyd faced off Chen with the exact same elemental set, he was losing out on the fight. And again, like I said, Chen has no fighting ability whatsoever, so give all of those powers to someone who can fight, like I said, and you do have a recipe for disaster. And I think Lloyd just simply wouldn't be able to beat that out in similar vein to how he couldn't beat out Chen, and that is why I believe the winner of the Tournament of Elements was going to be Skylar, and she was going to have not only the temporary powers, but also the full-fledged abilities, if Chen was actually telling the truth. But that is my outlook on what the Tournament of Elements could have looked like if it wasn't rigged, and I would love to know what your guys' opinion is. Is there someone who you think would have won over another? Is there someone who was knocked out too early, or do you think Lloyd would have won? I would love to know your opinion on it because I do think it's fairly interesting, but I just think with all the logic that we have available, it's fairly safe to assume that it would have been Skylar. But like I said, I would like to hear your own interpretation on how this could have gone. But apart from that, thank you very much for watching, and I do hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please consider subscribing. I love discussing Ninjago with more people, and if you do want to support the channel any further, which you do not have to, you could become a channel member and join the legends that you see on screen. Thank you to each and every single one of you, your support means the world to me. But like I said, that is about it for today, and take care. Okay, bye!